Along the highways of occupied southern Ukraine, a new kind of wreckage is piling up in the ditches. These aren't the burned-out tanks of the early war or the armored columns that littered the roads north of Kyiv back in 2022. These are tankers and fuel trucks that have been part of Russia's logistics network. 4 years into the war, these trucks lay abandoned. But that's because those same roads that were once used for supplying troops are nothing more than death traps. And it's all because Ukraine has managed to use drones for practically every conceivable purpose throughout this war, and after 4 years, it's expanded its use to include remote mine deployment. These tactics are quiet and rarely produce the dramatic explosions of a missile strike on an airfield. Deploying a mine doesn't really make for gripping social media posts or viral videos that make it to the news. And yet these drones are newsworthy because they're far more dangerous for Russia than you might first think. And ironically, it's Russia that pioneered drone drop mining earlier in this war. Now that exact tactic is being turned back against it on a scale Moscow never imagined. To understand why this matters, let's start with a shift in how Ukraine has been using drones. For most of this war, the drone story has been a hunting story. A first-person view drone chases down a single vehicle. A kamikaze drone slams into a single tank. It's precise, it's cheap, and it's deadly. But it's fundamentally about killing one target at a time. The new idea is to strangle the flow of opposing troops. In a way, it's similar to traditional guerrilla tactics that cut off supply lines. Only this time, there's far less risk involved for the drone operators. In late May, Ukraine's Minister of Defense, Mikhailo Fedorov, put a name to this tactic, announcing a dedicated program called a logistics lockdown. The goal, in his own framing, was to scale up strikes on the Russian rear and systematically dismantle Russia's ability to supply its own offensives. This wasn't a vague aspiration. The Defense Ministry backed the project with roughly $113 million, channeled directly to the drone brigades that had already proven they could hit Russian logistics. The money flows through Ukraine's merit-based point system, which ranks units by performance, so the best crews get the most resources. A second phase would open centralized tenders to buy these medium-range strike systems in bulk. And the target sits in a very specific band. These are what Ukraine calls middle strikes, hitting Russian targets roughly 20 to 300 kilometers behind the front line. That's usually where the supplies are gathered before they ever reach the trenches, so they're effectively cutting off the front line's lifeline. Fedorov claimed Ukraine had quadrupled its destruction of Russian logistics, warehouses, depots, and command posts since the beginning of 2026. The key here is that those logistics directly affect Russia's ability to conduct strikes. The more of them that get destroyed, the fewer defenses Ukraine would actually need. The numbers cited are striking, but they should be treated as Ukrainian claims rather than settled facts. In October of 2025, Fedorov said Russia was losing around 67 soldiers for every square kilometer it occupied. By April of 2026, that figure had climbed to 179. Ukraine estimates that casualties for the mid-2026 exceeded 35,000 killed or seriously wounded per month. Fedorov even credited part of the success to disabling Starlink terminals for Russian forces, cutting their connectivity even as their supplies dried up. The overall strategy itself isn't just a Ukrainian spin. The Institute for the Study of War, a respected US-based conflict monitoring organization, assessed that Ukraine's intermediate-range strike campaign had complicated traditional logistics, preventing Moscow from moving reinforcements and supplies forward in the numbers it used to. In plain terms, the rear is no longer safe. The place where an army is supposed to be able to catch its breath has become a kill zone. Even Russian sources have reported drone drop mining along the land corridor to Crimea, especially around the highway linking Mariupol and Melitopol. After a wave of renewed attacks by US-made Hornet drones, combined with suspected scatter mining along the M14 route running from Mariupol to Chongar, the occupation authorities made a serious error. They closed part of the highway and rerouted heavy truck traffic heading to Crimea. From there on, the problems spread. By late May, Vladimir Saldo, the Russian-installed governor of occupied Kherson, reported that a drone had dropped mines directly onto the roadway and shoulder of the R280 route. The road Russia has renamed the Novorossiya Highway, near the border between Kherson and Zaporizhia. A KAMAZ truck was reportedly destroyed. Several other vehicles were also damaged. Part of the road was shut down. And this came just days after Saldo had already temporarily restricted freight traffic along that same route, after Ukrainian strikes torched fuel tankers and trucks moving toward Crimea. Stop and notice who's reporting all of this. These are not Ukrainian propaganda channels. These are the Russian occupation officials themselves, the men whose entire job is to project an image of control. When they are the ones announcing road closures and destroyed trucks, that's about as credible as a signal you'll ever get that the disruption is real. So what's doing the work? The platform at the center of this is a drone called the FP2, built by the Ukrainian company Firepoint. It belongs to that middle strike class, and the design choices almost perfectly fit the strategy involved. Where Firepoint's earlier long-range drone, the FP1, could fly an astonishing 1,600 kilometers, the FP2 trades almost all of that range away to achieve a range of roughly 200 kilometers. But in exchange, it carries a far heavier warhead, around 105 kilograms, and it gives the operator real control. And when the launch setup that takes only around 18 minutes, it slots neatly into the gap between the deep strike missions of the FP1 and the heavier strike platforms behind it. The FP2 that's used for remote mining comes in two versions. The first flies autonomously to hit fixed targets at known coordinates. The other is controlled by an operator over a radio link with a live video feed, so a pilot can chase down something that's moving. This is similar to how you'd operate an FPV drone, except this one is far larger and far more lethal. Controllability is the key to laying down mines. Using the FP2 for these mining and rear area missions was indirectly confirmed by Dennis Stielerman, the co-founder of Firepoint. As a bonus, Ukraine has even begun strapping Soviet-era S-5 unguided rockets onto these mid-range drones, letting them attack ground targets without flying directly into them, with the first footage emerging over Crimea against a Russian mobile air defense group. But for the mining itself, the drones carry something cleverer than a single bomb. According to Russian footage, Ukraine is deploying aerial mine dispensers, essentially containers packed with small mines that can be scattered across a stretch of road in a single pass. One larger version reportedly holds up to 48 mines. A smaller one carries around 10. And these can be deployed not just from fixed-wing drones like the FP2, but from the heavy Baba Yaga multi-copters reserved for night operations. And this is where it helps to know that none of this is improvised or particularly new. One reporter described watching it firsthand back in 2024. On a trip with Ukraine's 23rd Mechanized Brigade near Chasiv Yar, he saw operators using the bomber drones to drop anti-tank mines onto Russian supply routes. Of course, there's also the fact that FPV drones have been previously used to drop anti-tank mines on tanks themselves. So, while the technique itself isn't particularly novel, the scale and ambition of the program are. At this point, Ukraine has the ability to field multiple waiting drones from a single control station at once. The same logic applies to mining with fixed-wing bombers, since the starting pieces are all there. They're simply being assembled into a different package. Now, for the mines themselves, information comes mostly from Russian sources, so it's fairly difficult to get an actual picture of what's being used. In all likelihood, Ukraine would mostly use anti-tank and anti-personnel mines that were leftover supplies from its existing stocks. Alternatively, it could be using modified Soviet mines, then strapping them to the drones so they could be used as delayed detonation devices. The independent picture is a little looser, but points in the same direction. One analyst had suggested the mines are actually 3D printed molds, using motion-sensitive or possibly magnetic influence fuses and carrying just enough explosive to immobilize a vehicle. And that word, immobilize, is the whole point. These mines don't actually need to destroy anything. A mine that merely disables a truck has already won. Think about what one stranded truck does on a supply road. It blocks the lane, it forces everything behind it to stop, it creates a backup, a cluster of stationary vehicles bunched together on an exposed highway, which is precisely the kind of stationary target that a drone operator dreams about. So the mine just has to stop in front of the convoy long enough for something else to finish the job. Think about the famous 42-mile tank convoy that we've seen in 2022. That same thing could be happening across vital Russian supply lines, all thanks to drones that are cheap to produce and use ready-made technologies. The Russians understand this perfectly, and their own military bloggers have been sounding the alarm. One prominent Russian war blogger, writing under the name Military Informant, warned that even small mines scattered regularly along the roads could lead to outright transport paralysis, because traffic has to be halted again and again for inspections and demining. Think about the asymmetry there. A kamikaze drone strike targets one vehicle. A scattered batch of mines threatens every vehicle that uses that road indefinitely until someone clears it. A single drop can shut a highway down. Another Russian war blogger, posting as Archangel of Special Forces, complained that logistics had been disrupted for nearly a month, hitting deliveries not just to the rear, but all the way to the front lines. And the most damning evidence of all this is human nature. According to reporting from inside occupied Crimea, fuel truck drivers have begun flatly refusing to make the runs without additional safety guarantees. Guarantees that, of course, no one can actually provide. The mining campaign has actually reached the point where the men paid to drive these roads would rather not drive them at all. But the mines are only one layer. Now, before we cover that, make sure to subscribe to the Military Show. We've got more analyses like these and post videos every day covering all the news you need to know. Back to the remote mining campaign. It could be argued that this is just the first vector of attack Ukraine uses. Picture this scenario. A Russian driver moving supplies south is no longer facing a single threat. He's moving through what amounts to be a layered interdiction zone. Above him, FPV ambush drones are waiting to drop. There are AI-enabled strike drones that can identify and lock onto a target with unnerving autonomy. The air defenses that are supposed to protect the road are themselves being hunted. And now, beneath his wheels, there's the constant possibility of a mine on the road surface itself. Threats from the air and threats from the ground, simultaneously on the same stretch of asphalt. And the reach of this is the quiet shock of the story. The M14 route between Mariupol and Melitopol sits roughly 100 to 150 kilometers behind the front line. To seed mines that far back, Ukraine needs fixed-wing drones or other long-range systems, exactly the kind of mid-strike platforms the FP2 represents. So the threat is no longer confined to the contact line, but stretches across the entire depth of Russia's rear in the south. And if you want proof that all of this is actually working, you can simply look at what's happening at the gas stations of Crimea. By early June of 2026, the peninsula was in the grip of a full-blown fuel crisis. The Moscow-backed governor, Sergei Aksyonov, imposed limits on the most common grade of gasoline and announced that people would have to use fuel coupons just to make a purchase. In Sevastopol, the historic home of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, witnesses described long queues snaking back from the filling stations and residents who said they're not being able to fill up for days. And the official explanations gave the game away. The reason cited by Russian officials was Ukrainian drone attacks on fuel trucks along the Novorossiya highway, the land corridor linking mainland Russia to Crimea. And the governors of both Crimea and Sevastopol admitted the problem would take at least 30 days to fix, with one of them pleading with the public not to panic. Here's the detail that ties the whole strategy together, and it comes straight from the Russian side. To get to Crimea, fuel isn't actually transported across the Crimean bridge at all, for safety reasons. While some gasoline moves by ferry across the Kerch Strait, that depends on the weather, which means that for fuel specifically, the land corridor running through those mined and drone-hunted highways is not just one option among several, it's the artery, and Ukraine has learned exactly where to squeeze. This is what makes the campaign so much more than a series of destroyed trucks. The disruption has reached ordinary life on the peninsula. It's produced lines at the pump, rationing coupons, and a 30-day timeline that nobody can guarantee. When a war on a distant highway shows up as an empty fuel tank in a civilian's car in Sevastopol, you're no longer talking about tactics, you're talking about strategic effect. So, how is Russia responding to the increased drone activity? Well, the answer ranges from the desperate to the almost comical. In one of the more remarkable footnotes of this entire war, Russian forces have started painting their trucks, both Kamaz and Ural models, in bold black and white striped patterns. Anyone who knows their military history will recognize it instantly. It's dazzle camouflage, the technique navies used on warships during the First World War. Back then, those wild geometric stripes were meant to confuse a human observer peering through a periscope, making it hard to judge a ship's speed, heading, and distance before firing. There's just one problem. The Russians appear to have misunderstood the entire point of it. Modern AI target recognition systems on Ukraine's drones don't estimate range and movement the way a World War I naval gunner did. Machine vision simply doesn't work like the human eye. And worse, many of these drones use thermal imaging, which sees heat, not paint. A drone operator looking through a thermal camera might not even notice the stripes at all. The more serious adaptation has been to move air defenses up to protect the roads, and that too has backfired in revealing ways. At one point, Ukraine Special Operation Forces reported striking 2 Russian Tor M2 air defense systems. One of them was hit while it was being hauled by a tractor along the M14 highway near occupied Berdyansk. Russia is so worried about the supply routes that it's moving its precious air defense systems to guard them, and in doing so, it's exposing those very systems to the same drones that they were sent to stop. There is, however, one countermeasure that could genuinely help. Russia could string overhead netting across the roads, the same anti-drone tunnels that have already started appearing on highways closer to the front. Against drones, those nets can work, but here the geography turns against Moscow. Covering a few hundred meters of frontline road is one thing, extending that protection across hundreds of kilometers of highway is a vastly more demanding task. And that points to the bigger prize behind all of this: Crimea itself. Ukraine has concentrated enormous resources around Crimea to suppress Russian air defenses and long-range fire assets. And there is a logic to the sequence. Once those defensive systems are down, the higher value targets they were guarding, the air bases, the missile launchers, becoming far more vulnerable. The mining and the strikes on the supply roads are part of the same web. They force Russia to spend its air defenses protecting trucks, which leaves the crown jewels more exposed. And as the land corridor becomes less and less reliable, Russia is pushed back onto the Kerch Bridge, one of the few remaining major arteries connecting Crimea to the mainland, a structure Ukraine has already struck repeatedly. It's possibly only a matter of time before a large enough missile hits the bridge to make it more or less unusable, at which point Crimea could be truly cut off from the rest of Russia. And that's precisely why the campaign is so elegant and effective. Ukraine appears to be attempting to increase the logistical cost of using the corridor or even capture a single meter of that highway. It simply needs to make the road expensive to use. If every truck takes longer, and if convoys need to be cleared and escorted, then the road can stay open on the map while becoming nearly useless in practice. And that brings us to where we started, to those burned-out tankers rusting in the ditches and the drivers who no longer want to make the run. Using drones to disrupt Russia's supply lines is the same asymmetric playbook that's defined Ukraine's entire drone war. This time, it's been refined and pointed at the one thing every army needs, and no army can replace: the steady flow of fuel and ammunition to the men at the front. But if you want to know how Ukraine managed to scale up its drone industry to this point, check out this video, and make sure to subscribe to the Military Show to stay up to date with the most recent developments.